Hello friends and welcome back. As you may have noticed, it's nearly Halloween and all of your friendly neighborhood costumers are releasing spooky content right and left. And well, I couldn't help jumping aboard that train. The prompt for this video started out as Halloween, but make it tacky, meant to poke some light fun at all those unnecessarily sexy Halloween costumes you see. You could call it Costube Goes Party City, and the general idea was to raid your closet or local thrift store and pull together some ridiculous Party City style Halloween costumes. But of course, living out of a suitcase means that my wardrobe is pretty limited and boring, and if I wanted a Halloween costume, I was gonna have to make one. But lately I've been seeing another Halloween fad making the rounds, and that is the Gunne Saxoween Challenge, where you recreate the iconic Gunne Sax dresses from the 70s and 80s, but give them a spooky twist. Now, so far every interpretation of that prompt that I've seen involves some suitably spooky Halloween fabrics that end up being turned into a gorgeous 1970s Does Edwardian-esque dress, so naturally I thought, what if I combine the two prompts? How can I make it tacky? I'm thinking Gunne Sax silhouette and style, but gaudy colors and textures, and an absolutely ridiculous character inspiration. You clicked on the thumbnail, so you clearly know what character I'll be choosing, and that is Jim Carrey from The Mask. But not the classic dapper yellow suited version, no. I'll be going for the completely over-the-top Cuban Pete version, because the 2-minute police conga line scene is my favorite of the movie, and because by now I've proved nothing if not that I'll go to ridiculous lengths to recreate costumes that are on screen for a fraction of the movie. Is this amalgamation of Halloween prompts going to be scary? No. Almost definitely not, but it will surely be a terrifying abomination that involves some garbage fabric and some ridiculous dance moves. Now, when I say garbage fabric, it's not because I'm trying to gatekeep fabric types, but because all of the fabrics for this costume were literally pulled out of the garbage, starting with this lovely pile that's been sitting on my lawnmower since being pulled out of a garbage bag last week when this silky blue fabric caught my eye. It's a good start, but let's go see what other potential fabrics I've got laying around that might do the job.
So besides the blue, I've got a couple white sheets salvaged in my dumpster diving Denmark video, some red cotton from a recycling center, some costume scraps I pulled from the garbage at work, and a rather sad assortment of appropriately colored lace. I also thought this would be the perfect time to use up some of my less sturdy threads, salvaged from all over the city, and perhaps not up to a garment that's going to get daily wear, but surely good enough for a one-off costume. Can I turn this pile of literal garbage into something that's recognizable either by character or by style? I guess we're gonna find out.
So here's the thing. The original Gunne Sax dresses, named after actual gunny sacks or the bags used for potatoes and sack races, were known for being flounced, poofy, and lacy, recreating a romantic Renaissance or Edwardian silhouette with light and airy cotton calicos and gravity-defying gauzy or sheer materials that made their dresses seem weightless, which is absolutely not what I'll be working with. But hey, it's supposed to be tacky, right? If we look at Cuban Pete's costume, he's wearing this amazing blue Roomba shirt with huge ruffles on the arms, which already we're in fantastic Party City territory here. And then he's got the red neck scarf and white high-waisted pants with a blue stripe running down the side. Seems pretty simple, but the challenge is going to be melding this with this. I'm thinking to start with the sleeves because that's what I have the clearest idea of how to go about doing, and they're probably the single most iconic part of this look, so I've got to get them right. I'm thinking to keep them pretty similar to how they are in the film, but to taper the sleeves down to a long Edwardian style tight buttoned cuff, and to get started, I'll need to cut out those ruffles. Lots and lots of ruffles.
This blue silk fabric was as shifty as a 10-speed clutch, so for the rest of the bodice, I decided to back it with this much more stable blue cotton pulled from the same garbage bag as the main fabric. Once I was done cutting and basting, the sleeves were sewn closed and the seams ironed flat. Then I started tracing out where I would attach the ruffles, drawing a line that spiraled down the arm to mimic the layers and layers of ruffles in the original shirt. Before attaching my ruffle strip, I decided to give it a test run and decided that the ruffles looked a little limp, so I ran a line of gathering threads along the inside circumference of the strip to give the ruffles a little chick-chicky boom. The ruffles were then pinned down in short sections and stitched on by hand. Next, I started on the cuffs. This cuff has two layers, the inside and the outside, both of which were stitched up, given a press, and pinned together. Then the inside was sewn to the outside along 3 edges before being turned inside out and, you guessed it, pressed flat. Then the sleeve could be gathered down to fit the cuff. Once it was the right size, it could be pinned on and stitched down, trapping the sleeve in between the 2 layers of the cuff. Alright, so I worked a bunch on this shirt last night off camera just to try and finish it up a little bit, and I've gotten to this point here, which I'm pretty satisfied with. They are not finished yet. They need some finishing details, such as the buttons on the cuff, and obviously the red stitching on the trim of the ruffles. But all in all, I think it looks pretty good. The ruffles need to be evened out because they are very, very uneven. That fabric is just a pain in the butt to work with. It shifts around so much, so those ruffles were not cut very evenly, and consequently they're not sitting very evenly. So gonna work on that. I think I'm gonna pin them on to the mannequin and trim them down like that. And then I also went ahead and worked on cutting out and basting the rest of the bodice pieces, using as a base the shirtwaist pattern that I pattern tested last week for a friend because I know that it fits me pretty well, although I definitely modified it a bit because originally there was some insertion lace here and lots of pin tucks in the front that I won't be using. But I do love that the waistline is marked off because that might make it a lot easier to attach the skirt. So let's start assembling these. The torso was sewn entirely with French seams, not out of any particular love for the method, but because I don't have access to a serger at home, and leaving the edges of this fabric raw to fray was not an option. With the bodice sewn up, I turned back to the sleeves, pinning them onto my mannequin in order to clean up the ruffle layers before taking them into work and running them through the serger. The next part of my plan to Gunne saxify this costume was to add a V-shaped frill on the chest that would imitate many of the Edwardian style dresses from the brand, and that would also help unify the arm ruffles with the rest of the bodice. With the blouse on pause until I could get into work, I switched to working on the skirt, starting out with the same McCall's pattern I used for Bilbo's robe because I already owned it, it had wonderful volume, and the pattern already had an opening built in for the front of the robe, which I would simply rotate to the back of this dress to line up with the button placket of the blouse. But while it was a good starting point, this skirt wasn't very Gunne sex, so I decided to add 2 layers of flounces, starting by chopping off the bottom 10 inches or so of the current skirt. A second flounce at the same height was also cut. These strips were joined with French seams, although in the end it was a bit pointless since the rest of the seams of the skirt were left raw. Apparently nobody throws out pure white thread either, so the whole skirt was sewn with nearly white thread. Then it was time to break out my ruffle attachment and start gathering all this fabric down. This took forever, and while this technique definitely isn't an exact science, for a quick Halloween costume it certainly did the job. Then the ruffles could be pinned onto the skirt, and when I ran out of pins because this was a cartoonishly colossal hem, I switched to clips. I'm ashamed to admit that it wasn't until this very moment that I realized I was essentially making a petticoat, which honestly made me feel better about spending hours and hours sewing it because it meant it could be repurposed and reused later on for other costumes. It also meant that I should probably try to keep it clean and not stain it with something bright red such as, say, pomegranate juice. Then it was off to work, stopping along the way at my favorite thrift store to see if I could find some lace to snazz up the plain white skirt. I'm lucky enough to have access to a serger at work, and I thought some bright red thread would be the perfect way to finish up the edges of the sleeve ruffles. Fast, efficient, blocking the raw edges, and fun. On my way out, I checked the garbage can, as is my habit, and pulled out a nice hunk of black felt which will come in handy a bit later.
Alright, today is the last day of this project because Halloween is coming up very quickly on us. I was able to go into work and use the serger there to finish off the edges of all these ruffles with some bright red thread. So now all of the individual layers of those ruffles sort of stand out a bit more from each other, and it starts to look a little bit more like the costume from the film. Is it exactly similar? Is it an identical replica? No. but it is significantly better than it was yesterday. So that has been done. After I serged the ruffles, I then added all of the buttonholes on the cuff and then along the back of the bodice, and I attached the sleeves. So now it is one whole heavy ruffly unit instead of being 3 separate pieces. I do need to now attach this to the skirt, which is essentially a petticoat. And then to the rest of the day will just be spent kind of tying up all sorts of little random loose ends, like sewing on buttonholes and figuring out how to attach these together and adding some little trim, and then figuring out a hat. I still need to cover a hat and add some little doodaddies to the brim. So today is going to be a very busy day. We have a lot of work to do and not a whole lot of time to do it. So let's get to it.
Besides the lace, I also picked up some perfect tacky plastic buttons in bright colors, red for the wrist cuffs and blue for the back of the bodice. My shirt was nearly done, except that it was missing a collar, so that was basted first by hand and then machine before being cut out, because collars are finicky with curves and tight corners, and I did not want the extra headache of dealing with my fabric shifting around on me. It really got me thinking about all the extra challenges and hurdles that working with recycled materials poses. Picking fabric out of a garbage bag instead of a fabric shop is good for the environment and definitely my wallet, but it also meant that every piece I cut out had several additional steps tacked onto it in order to make sure the final product looked good. This time around, I had plenty of fabric, so I didn't have to get creative with piecing, but I did have to worry about my fabric literally fraying itself into oblivion and leaving a fine coating of blue dust all over everything. It felt great to use up all that old thread I had sitting around from when somebody threw out an old hand-me-down sewing kit, but I did pay for it when my gathering threads occasionally snapped because they couldn't take the stress I was putting them under. It's a creative challenge that I enjoy, and, like our film's protagonist says,
waste not, want not.
But just remember that these extra steps and obstacles can also stretch a project out longer than originally planned or require some flexibility in the design process. Like when the absolute mountain of lace you got turns out to be only enough for half of your hem, and you decide that only the front half of your skirt is gonna get the fancy trim. After pinning the lace on, I decided to stitch it by hand, both because at this point my machine was
Okay.
but also because it'll be easier to remove later if I want to turn this into a proper petticoat. Not having any proper blue bias tape or binding of any kind, I reinterpreted the blue stripe down the leg by making a long tube of the main fabric and gathering it down tightly, then sewing it down the side seams of the skirt. Then the skirt could be gathered down and attached to the bodice along the waistline with 2 lines of stitches, which would allow for a drawstring to be inserted and enabling my hips to carry some of the weight of what was by now a fairly heavy outfit. The last step for the dress was to finish tacking down the chest ruffles, now that the sleeves were sewn on, and then all that was left was a hat, which was made by covering this pink straw hat, found at a recycling center and perfect for a turn-of-the-century cycling outfit, with some of that black felt from work and pom-pom trim. The trim in the movie is black, but my choices are light blue or orange, so...
Let's rock this joint!